definitely have, with Adrian, added even more complexity to the conversation because I think Adrian has really helped us in thinking in category of thoughts of what could really be the role of enabling versus disenabling. And I think what we retain is really the pattern of failure that he was able to share and document with us. That might not be intentional, but they have somehow impacted the effectiveness of the state in enabling the conversation on entrepreneurship. I guess you realize that natural questions are popping up in our head, and it's time for us also to make sure these questions are animating our debate. We have a little bit less than half an hour, but if we manage the time properly, it will be a dynamic and lively half an hour. But I'd like to take advantage of my role as the chair to ask the first question, if you allow me to, because I think it's a low-hanging fruit from the conversation. And it's really more a question that would touch every single speaker in many ways. We have heard about the large amount of money being invested in financing important projects. And I think Mariana provided us with a lot of research that is coming from her work that goes into that direction. We also heard the whole idea about the state facilitating the opportunity for breaking rules. At the same time, we're hearing that a role of the state that might be too dominant in the case that Hayes shared with us might really generate a clumsiness in the system to the point in which you're not really letting market test how strong the ideas really are. And finally, we tend to have, yes, a lot of money allocated from state, but a lot of failure. So clearly the question that I'd like to start is, how do we reconcile this? It looks like the trend of government investing large amount of money is something that we see recurrent. At the same time, we have a high degree of failure, either failure or low productivity or poor ratio. So it looks like we really are caught into a potential risk. And I'd like my speaker to maybe think, how do we reconcile these two trends, investing a lot of money versus at the same time decreasing our rate of failure? And I think each single speaker will have a story to share with us in terms of how we can navigate this dilemma. Mariana, would you like to share your initial thoughts on how this large amount of money can possibly be invested in a way in which the degree of ineffectiveness is not so high?
First, I just want to congratulate myself for not having a heart attack, because I think I heard all the stereotypical points that I've heard for the last 30 years, and I asked myself, how can it be that we don't move on? Because the point is not the DNA of the state is somehow great and it has to go and do. It's let's learn from the few examples where the state, precisely because it actually thought these things through and didn't just throw money and didn't just do things top down, et cetera, actually did more than just enabling. Because again, the few places in the world where big things did happen through innovation did not just have a state as an enabler. So, in China, one of the big issues is currently there's lots of money, yes. It's too focused on one part of that innovation chain, yes. It's too top-down and not decentralized across different types of institutions, yes. The mission's coming from politics and not from the organizations, yes. Those are all points in, well, not just myself, there's other people, by the way, who've done lots of this really interesting work, that we really have to give attention to the organizations, to the examples, as long as we keep saying the state, it's too bureaucratic, it's too slow. I mean, we've just lived through a financial crisis, which, was caused by the private sector. It was caused by private debt. Does that make us think, the private sector sucks, it'll never innovate?
Subsidies to public home ownership.
Exactly, subsidies. Another example, and then I'll shut up, otherwise I could go on forever. Subsidies is not what I'm talking about. In Italy, where I'm from, proud to be Italian for things like the Renaissance, but surely not for the last 20 years, Italy thinks that the role of the public sector is subsidies. What I've been talking about is not subsidizing, not helping sectors, by the way. The stupidest way to do industrial strategy is to think of sectors. But if you think of big problems, thank you, that lots of your different sectors can work together in new ways, lots of different interesting public-private partnerships where you might have a mission like going to the moon, but then allow lots of experimentation bottom up and invest directly to make new things happen that would not have happened anyway, instead of this parasitic sort of favor kind of thing, which either happens in countries like Italy or in the UK, which has no clue what the state is. David Cameron's famous quote was, civil servants are the enemies of enterprise. Well, now, you can imagine all these civil servants who now have to deal with Brexit, how happy they are not to be entrepreneurial. That kind of state that has no clue what the state is for ends up listening to business and asking business, what should we do? And gets really stupid innovation policies like the patent box. Patents are already monopolies for 20 years. There's no reason that a policymaker should increase the profits even more from the patent. You should direct the policy towards increasing the research that leads to the patent. GlaxoSmithKline completely captured the UK government, getting that policy through. So this issue of capture, this issue of vested interest, if anything, is even greater in countries that have no clue what the public sector is for and either just subsidize or try to be business friendly and end up with really problematic policies in the name of innovation.
I think that, Mariana, you spoke of the DNAs of the state. Let's perhaps...
Not DNA.
I think that it really goes back to the DNAs of an entrepreneurial society. I think that should be the focus. When you think about an entrepreneurial society, you think about freedom of choice, a free flow of information. You think of uncertainties. You think of trial and errors. You think about bottom up rather than top down. And I think that innovation today is increasingly more open. Innovation, collaborative innovation, it is bottom up, it is rolling up, as Gary Hamel said, not rolling out. So I use the case of China, and you may say that's a unique case. But when you think about the state, it's not an abstract term. It's really about who. It's the bureaucrats. What makes a bureaucrat a bureaucrat? What are the attributes that make them successful? They are middle of the road. They tend to be very good at following orders. They are politically savvy. They're not necessarily having the DNAs of entrepreneurs. They tend to be risk averse rather than risk takers. So whether this bureaucrat sits in China or sits here or where, that is irrelevant. I think that fundamentally the DNAs of entrepreneurial society calls for more freedom, more from the bottom up, more entrepreneurships, less state. While we cannot strike a perfect balance, I think that there's more danger to emphasize the role of the state, less danger in emphasizing the importance of the market.
Can I just come back to this for 1 minute, because she misunderstood.
Sure, Mariana.
So what I said was, it's not about the DNA, neither of the public sector, nor about the public sector. It's about what kind of public, what kind of private. Now, personally, I think that what you've just said creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Who would want to work in the public sector if you've just heard that, the bureaucrat is middle of the road, is inertial? Steve Chu, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, was running the Department of Energy. And he was inspired to do so because it was a mission-oriented department. He would not have done it in Italy, where there isn't currently a mission-oriented notion of the state. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy that how we talk about the state, how you've just talked about it, affects who wants to work in the state. It's extremely dangerous and it's ideological.
And I think that politicians,
I may
Sorry, I'm going to put this down.
need to migrate the conversation to
The boys.
quoting Yuval Harari, the author of Homo sapiens. The state is a collective fiction, so it only exists in the moment in which to define the construct. But to some extent, a chicken is more real than a state in that sense, right? And I think we have to position the conversation about whether we're talking about constructs or we're talking about things that are to some extent real. And I think the state in some context might be more of a surreal entity than anything else. So Eyal, I'd like to have your reaction. And Adrian, I saw you writing, and that caused me thinking that definitely you have something to share on this conversation. And before we are asking you to help us with this dialogue and answering your question.
Sure. Well, I'm going to stick with my theme, but I'm going to answer your question, okay? Because I think, to me, the important part is, can argue forever about whether the state should facilitate or subsidize or do this or give that. But if there's nobody on the receiving end, nothing happens, right? And the receiving end of entrepreneurship is disruptive. It's going against what exists. It's not improving on or going by a certain plan. Look, I think it's a little bit like parenting, okay? I mean, we have a role as parents. We baby-proof the living room, we buy the right books, we tell the bedtime story, we may advise our kids what they should study in school. But the truth is, everybody in here knows we don't know what will come up out of our children. And we can have two kids of the same DNA pool and with the same bedtime stories, and each of them will go their own way. And I think most parents recognize at one point that helicopter parenting doesn't work. And our best bet is to encourage our kids to ask questions, to be curious, to find their own way. Now, this is a cultural issue, and I recognize it's very difficult to talk about because you can't have a policy summit about culture, right? You gotta reduce it to practice. You gotta reduce it to practice through the education system, but you can also reduce it to practice through the corporate system. It's not about what the people will do, whether people will ask questions. It's about what managers do when their employees ask questions, right? That's the key. And you know, corporate is as important as education. The average first-time entrepreneur in the US starts a company, his or her first company, 12 years after graduating from college, which means that they've worked for 12 years in a certain corporate environment, mostly. And it reminds me of the story of the human resource manager who came to the CEO and said, you know, I don't think we should teach them all this creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship classes, because what happens if they take all this and leave? And the CEO told him, what if we don't teach and they stay? Okay? This is really the essence. It's the essence of cultural diffusion, so that there's always somebody on the receiving end to tell us which policies work and which policies do not.
Thank you very much. Adrian, I'd like to have your insights on this.
I just wanted to say, first of all, that I think we have to deal with the state as it is, rather than some imaginary or idealized version of the state. And as I said, I think the state as it is becoming degraded in terms of its ability to innovate or to act as a creative force in the world. But it's very, very important to look at what's actually happening, as we see in China, rather than to say, well, it would be wonderful if certain conditions were fulfilled. But secondly, I think it's also important to understand that there are certain characteristics that the state will always have, which are going to limit its ability to be an innovator. One is accountability, that the state is accountable to the citizenry and has to make accounts of what it's doing. And secondly, that there are limits imposed by the nature of public money, that if you're using public money, you have to impose certain limits on what you do with it. So the state can only, to a very limited extent, be a risk-taking entity, because it has to be responsible to its people and responsible to its taxpayers for what it does with all of that. Which leads me to conclude that insofar as the state is an innovator, it has to be very careful to subcontract to responsible agencies or to specialized organizations or to universities a lot of the work that it does, so subcontract to a lower level, and also put time limits on what it does. So contract, compete, and time limit what you do, otherwise you will get rent-seeking, gravy trains, and the rest of it.
Thank you, Henry. So I'd like to, we start having some of the questions that came from you, but I'd like, first of all, James Guild, which is our Drucker Challenge discussant, to start with the first question. James, you're over there, right? So maybe if we can have, and I'll get up so I can. I've been sitting for too long. So I'll come over here. So it looks like I got something interesting to say. James, would like to start with your question, and please let me know if it's a question to everyone or if you want to address the question to one of our panelists.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's a question about China. So China has reached a point where it should be transitioning away from export-led growth and towards a more balanced economy with healthy domestic consumption. This would require a dynamic, innovative domestic services sector, for instance. So what can or should the state do to be managing that transition effectively? And what are the prospects for managing that transition?
Right. And Jane, do I assume that this question goes first to
That's
Haya? Yeah?
probably the best,
Yeah.
best bet.
So, Hayan, do you want to take this question?
Yes, thank you for the question. I would want to correct a little bit in terms of China's growth model. The impression was that China's growth was export-led. And I would correct it as China's growth was really investment-led, very much dependent on investment, and a lot of that investment in industries, manufacturing, real estate, etc. And then, of course, when you need to move mountains, build big factories, state played a big role. In terms of China's transitioning, the shifts should be on several fronts. One is shifting from imitation to innovation. There's a lot of challenges there. And another is shifting from manufacturing being such a heavy sector to more service-driven society. And I think that that will happen not because the state wants it, but that's just a natural process of economic development. When the per capita income grows from $182 in 1979 to $8,000 today and bound to become $15,000, when people have money, people will use this to consume. They may not be buying refrigerators or buying air conditioners, but they will spend on luxury products, they will spend traveling, they will spend on services. China is aging very rapidly. There's a large need for healthcare, for elderly care, and these are services. They're traveling abroad. So the process of shifting towards more of a service-driven economy is happening. It's already happening, and the service sector now accounts for above 50% of the economy, 55%, and the goal is to reach 60% by 2030. And I think that's the natural process of the evolution of the economy. I have more confidence of that happening in terms of shifting away from investment, from top-down driven of an economy to more of an innovative economy, letting the total productivity to drive economic growth. There, I think I have more question marks.
Right. Thank you very much. I'd like to actually start selecting one of the questions that came, and Vladimir, you asked a question that I'd like all our panelists to answer. I'll read it out first. What should be the role of the state in the fourth industrial revolution? To what degree should the state help people who lose their job because of automation? What's your position on the introduction of the universal basic income? Just a preface on this, part of the work I do is the World Economic Forum, and the fourth 1 year ago, the fourth industrial revolution as part of on the agenda. And the fourth industrial revolution, if you haven't heard this before, is the integration of biological, physical, and digital, and is the redefinition of what does labor mean, what does planet mean, and what does life means on Earth. So it's a profound transformation that observed the increasing trends that are reshaping some of our tenets. And it's not coming as a successor to the third industrial revolution. It's to some extent happening at the same time. So I'd like your views on this. Adrian, I'd like to start from you this time, mainly on jobless, automation, universal basic income. If you can share a couple of thoughts with us.
It's such a difficult question. I'm not sure that I have very much to say about it, except that I think that I'm very, very pessimistic about the future. I think that what we're going to see is an enormous process of job destruction because of automation and the rest of it. I think we're also going to see an enormous process of concentration of capital in the hands of a small number, a relatively small number of superstar companies which are going to dominate productivity, dominate innovation. We're going to see waves of popular unrest because of all this concentration, because of all of this disruption, because all of the subsequent unemployment that is going to be created as a result of this. These companies will be incredibly productive, incredibly globalized, very, very difficult to pin down and make accountable to any people because they operate in a world above that sort of accountability. And I think that the role of the state, increasingly in the future, will be to try and look after people who are unemployed and left behind, and to try and keep order as you get increasing discontent and riots in the street. So concentration of capital, populist revolts, and the state increasingly resorting to its role as a policeman in the world. That's what I think is going to happen.
Right. Mariana, would like to share your insight on where you see role of state going with increasing automation and even the question of universal basic income, if you like.
So I'd like to sort of first take it from the analysis. There's this assumption that it's the robots, that it's automation that's taking jobs. Just have to read David Ricardo in the 1800s, chapter 31 of his textbook, Principles of Political Economy. That question was being asked then. The big change that has happened is not automation. There's been huge amounts of automation, mechanization. The mass production revolution had a huge effect on jobs. The really defining characteristic that we have today, which the state could do a lot and is not doing a lot, is this incredible financialization of large multinational companies. And the S&P 500, the top 500 companies have spent over $3 trillion of their profits on things like share buybacks. They are not reinvesting this money back into human capital formation, back into R&D. Cisco, Amgen, Apple today, not Apple under Steve Jobs, Apple under Tim Cook, $100 billion share buyback scheme. That financialization is a huge problem in terms of skills, because where do skills come from? They actually come not just from public training programs, but they used to also come from experiences within companies. What can the state do? It can obviously do the training programs, but that's not revolutionary. What it could also do is be a bit more forceful with these companies that have received, for all the reasons that I've said, both good and bad, massive not only subsidies but investments in terms of reinvesting profits. And Bell Labs, one of the most important innovation R&D labs in a private company, AT&T, came out of that kind of deal with government. AT&T was a monopoly. Government said to retain your monopoly status, you have to reinvest your profits back into the real economy, back into innovation, and big innovation, not just what serves you in your little telecoms area. We don't have that kind of healthy, symbiotic deal-making today. We have lots of parasitic deals, but this actually requires the government to have a vision, to have a mission, and not to think it's just an enabler.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I actually would like maybe to ask you from the plenary to ask a question. I think it's a good time for us to do this. I do have questions that are coming also from the Slido, but some of this question and answer were integrated by some of the answer. So I'll take the liberty to open it to the forum. And please say your name.
My name is Pranjal. I'm also one of the challenge finalists. My question is, we've talked a lot about the state. Now, in a case where the state has not worked well, like in the case of Nevada, where a lot of solar companies were taxed and they had to shut down and they were not really helping the economy and the entrepreneurs, what do you see as what the entrepreneurs should do in that kind of situation to really help the state or achieve a place where they can either help the entrepreneurs at large or at least not forcefully interfere in the cycle or in the growth of the entrepreneurial ecosystem? So how do you think entrepreneurs react to a state that is not doing its job well in the state as an enabler, inventor, and innovator?
So thank you for your question. Hey, I would like to take
Sure. One of the beautiful things about entrepreneurial societies is that the term social entrepreneurship has really become prevalent in the last few years. So you have a lot of people with entrepreneurial spirit who do exactly as you suggest. They give back to society. They do not give back necessarily to the capitalistic system. And I think, again, it all starts with the same thing, right? You have people who have a certain trait of personality. And each one is driven by a certain force. And many people are driven by the force of making society better, which you may translate to helping the government do its job. That's a philosophical, ideological question. I think entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship. You may invent the next great technology or solar energy equipment or a new tool for microfinance or microloans, which are really social entrepreneurship. They all start and end at the same place, which is what is the infrastructure that allows for these people to express themselves through these types of endeavors.
Great. Let's collect maybe now another couple round of questions that we can discuss as we're trying to finish the session. So, any questions? I see someone in the back. A lady with, okay. And then I think we have the first question, and then there's a lady right there that would like to also ask a question. Please, your name as well.
My name is Per. I'm coming from Sweden. I'm actually working within HR. It seems that it's a lot of focus on we want to work or create something to make money. When I try to do the reflection, what does the youth of today want is actually to have a life. They want to work, to have a private life. So what is your reflection on that one in terms of, well, the conversation you've had so far?
Great question. And we'll collect another one. There was a lady in the same line that was raising her hand. Down there, yes.
Thank you. Jim Clifton of the Gallup organization has written quite a bit about the millennial generation being much less likely to be an entrepreneur than the generation before it or after it. And I just was wondering what role the state might play with that challenge.
Great. And I think actually interesting that the two questions can actually be combined in the same answer in many ways, because I think they create some degree of balance. So why don't we take one final question? Well, Anil here in the front. Maybe two. Let's do, if you can do in 15 seconds, and then have another question there, and then we'll have concluded our question and final remarks. Anil, please.
So here is an alternate hypothesis to what Mariana was saying, because one of your points was that the state essentially de-risks the private entrepreneur. And I wonder if it's exactly the opposite, because if I look at Kleiner Perkins, for example, what is the risk that Kleiner will fail versus one of its ventures will fail? The risk for the venture is at least 10 times higher than Kleiner Perkins. And the reason, of course, Kleiner Perkins still faces risk because it has other competing VCs. But who exactly is the competitor to the US as a VC? So the risk of the US failing is much less than Kleiner failing, which is much less than the entrepreneur failing. So that's an alternate. And the second is, yes, the state plays a huge role, but why do we call it the entrepreneurial state? Why don't we just call it the state?
Great, Anil. And our final question that we collect. Your name as well, please.
My name is Erhard Friedberg. I want to relate to what
Not sure we can hear you.
Adrian said, which is really very worrying, and as well as what
Can't hear
Mariana
you.
said.
Next to the microphone. Thank you. Yeah.
Turn it on.
And
Just so?
yeah,
You hear me?
perfect,
Okay.
perfect. Yeah.
Mariana said only a very few graduates from Kennedy School want to go to government. And then you listen to Adrian and you say you understand why. If the state is really only that, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how could we rethink public policy education? Because I think it isn't up to the state that you have been describing. So how could we make the state more interesting for interesting people to go there?
Thank you very much. So we have actually 4 questions that will be to some extent clustered in a comprehensive answer. And I actually like all of you, if you feel like, to provide me with a sense, or you can take a partial view on one question versus the other. The question about life and millennial on one side, and then should we call it just state rather than entrepreneurial? And can we rethink public policy? And these are kind of the story that we have on the table. So, hi, please.
Yeah. Regarding the first question about millennials, China has the most number of millennials. China has over 450 millennials. So with 450 millennials, we see contradicting pictures. On the one hand, these millennials grow up in the reform era, they access technology. Today's technology is far more global, and they have all the access to venture capital money, not only domestically but internationally. So they have a lot more opportunities. They have less hesitance, less fear. Actually, they on the fear part, that's the contradicting aspect. Because of the increasing inequality. And we found millennials to begin to worry more about safety, more about having jobs, more about having income to cover their living, particularly in cities where the real estate prices are sky high. So on the one hand, they can access a lot, but on the other hand, they have this fear over safety of living, and because of the inequality. Regarding the question about how do you make the bureaucrats more competent, I think the answer is you make government smaller. The smaller the government, the more selective the bureaucrats will be, and then naturally, you have more talented, more capable people working for the government.
All right, thank you very much. I have to finish, so shall I get a 15 seconds reaction from Adrian, Hale, and Mariana, and then we're going to be ready for the session to be over, but you have to stay where you are because Prabhu has an important announcement to make. Adrian.
On the millennial generation, I think that we had a peculiar period in history from about 1980 to about 2000 when it was very rational to become, for young people to become an entrepreneur. And that period is now coming to an end because more and more economic activity is concentrated in this handful of superstar companies. The number of company foundations is going down, the number of IPOs is going down, the price of living in the big cities around the world is going up. So now the rational thing for young people to do is to become a corporate man or corporate woman.
Hale.
Yeah, I gotta take this on this millennial question. I think it's gonna be great. Or as Trump says, it's gonna be fine, it's gonna be fine. Yeah, you'll have, and I think you're very right about your observation, you'll have millions and millions of young, bright minds thinking, how can I work less and make more? And I just think it's gonna be great in terms of entrepreneurship. That's my bet.
Mariana.
So just quickly in the last two, I didn't use the word de-risk. I don't like the word de-risk. The state takes risks, so does the private sector. The difference is that whereas Kleiner Perkins, for every Genentech success, it's got some failures, but it can use the upside from the Genentech to cover those downsides. The state hasn't had that. And I actually argue that the state should have that, and it can actually also attract talent, some lead investors who might find it interesting to work with such a portfolio. For every internet, you're going to have lots of Concords. For every Tesla, you will have lots of Cylindras. Just think of all the big innovations that have come out recently, whether it's fracking, state-funded. There's a huge report on that. Self-driving cars, almost all state-funded. The cure to Ebola, state-funded. For each one of these successes, there's many failures. What I've been arguing is we don't have the framework to think about this, so we just look at the failures and then we go after the state. And this self-fulfilling prophecy thing you said, basically that's what I said, that we need to rethink the role of the state, both in terms of looking at the successes and actually admitting where those successes came from instead of this very strange version of history that we've been sold in Silicon Valley, but to do more than that. We actually need measures of public value. Believe it or not, in economics, the word doesn't exist. In philosophy, we have social value and public value and things like virtue. In economics, we don't. And so I actually think we haven't even tried to think about the metrics and the objective function that we really should have in the public sector.
The best way we have to finish this before Prabhu is going to give us some information is to thank our panelists for this lively conversation. Thank you very much.